Story 1. The EMTB trainee's call that wasn't logged. I found myself kneeling beside an elderly woman whose pulse felt like ice water moving beneath paper skin. She smiled at me with recognition I hadn't earned and whispered my mother's maiden name, a name I'd never spoken aloud in my adult life. When I looked down at my glove, there was no blood, but my hand felt wet. The address on my run sheet showed numbers that didn't exist on any map I'd ever studied, yet I'd driven there without hesitation, following roads that seemed to know exactly where I needed to go. My first solo overnight shift as an EMTB trainee began with the kind of confidence that comes from ignorance. I'd passed my practical exams 3 weeks prior and completed 16 supervised calls without incident. The senior medics at Station 12 told me I had steady hands and a calm voice. 2 qualities they said mattered more than speed or strength. On that particular October night, I believed them. I reported to the bay at 2200 hours, checked the drug box seals, inventoried bandages and IV supplies, and settled into the passenger seat with a thermos of coffee and a pocket guide to cardiac rhythms. The station occupied a converted fire hall on the eastern edge of the county, serving a patchwork of rural addresses and unincorporated townships. Our coverage area stretched across 60 square miles of farmland, scattered housing developments, and 2-lane roads that turned to gravel without warning. Dispatch operated from a regional center 30 miles away, coordinating 6 ambulance units across 3 counties. Radio traffic that night was sparse. A diabetic emergency in Sector 4, a possible stroke in Sector 2. Standard calls, routine voices. I listened to the rhythm of it, learning the cadence of how requests flowed from caller to dispatcher to unit. At 0115, my portable radio crackled with static, then cleared. A female dispatcher's voice, calm, clipped, professional, spoke my unit number and requested I respond to a medical emergency at 473 Oakmont Terrace. Possible respiratory distress, elderly female, conscious and alert. I acknowledged the call, noted the time and address in my logbook, and started the engine. My partner for the evening, a paramedic named Garrett, was on medical leave following a back injury, so I'd been cleared to run basic calls alone under remote supervision. This qualified. Respiratory distress in a conscious patient. I could handle it. I entered the address into the GPS unit mounted on the dashboard. The device hesitated longer than usual, its screen flickering before displaying a route. 16 minutes estimated travel time. I activated the light bar and pulled onto the county highway, heading south toward a neighborhood I didn't recognize by name but assumed lay within our sector. The road unspooled in the headlights, flat, tree-lined, empty. No other vehicles, no house lights, just pavement and darkness and the occasional reflective road sign catching the red pulse of my flashers. 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed the GPS route didn't match the county maps I'd memorized during training. Oakmont Terrace should have branched off Highway 19 near the old grain cooperative, but the device directed me past that turnoff and onto a narrow access road I'd never noticed before. The pavement there was older, cracked in geometric patterns that suggested decades of freeze-thaw cycles. The trees pressed closer on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that swallowed the moonlight. I slowed, checking the address again. 473 Oakmont Terrace. The GPS insisted I was on the correct route. I tried raising dispatch for confirmation, but my radio produced only static. I switched channels. Still static. I continued driving, trusting the device, trusting the call, trusting my training. The road curved gently, then straightened. Ahead, a cluster of streetlights appeared. Old sodium vapor lamps that cast everything in sickly amber. Beneath them sat a row of small houses, single-story structures with narrow porches and mailboxes tilted at uniform angles. The architectural style felt wrong for the area. These homes looked like post-war construction, Bungalows from the 1950s, not the modern prefabs or century-old farmhouses that dotted our coverage zone. I located 473 by the numbers painted on the curb. The house was dark except for a porch light that flickered intermittently as though the bulb was failing. I parked at the curb, grabbed my jump bag and portable oxygen, and approached the front door. No doorbell. I knocked. The sound seemed muffled, absorbed by the wood rather than echoing inside. I waited, knocked again. The door swung inward on its own, revealing a dim entryway with floral wallpaper and a runner rug worn threadbare down the center. "EMS," I called. "Anyone home?" A voice answered from deeper in the house. Female, elderly, strained. "In here, the bedroom." I stepped inside, my boots silent on the old carpet. The air smelled of lavender and dust and something faintly medicinal I couldn't identify. I followed a short hallway past a kitchen frozen in mid-century design. White metal cabinets, a percolator on the counter, a calendar on the wall showing a month and year I didn't focus on. The bedroom door stood open. Inside, a woman sat upright in bed, propped against pillows, her hands folded in her lap. She was perhaps 80 years old, with thin white hair and skin that seemed translucent in the weak lamplight. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, her lips faintly blue. I introduced myself, knelt beside the bed, and began my assessment. Radial pulse weak and thready. Respiratory rate 30 per minute. Lung sounds diminished bilaterally with faint wheezing. She watched me with calm, knowing eyes as I worked, never showing the panic respiratory distress usually provokes. I asked her name. She gave it, Evelyn Marsh, and spelled it without my prompting. I asked about her medical history. She listed conditions and medications in the precise order I would have written them. Congestive heart failure, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, hypertension. She rattled off the drug names and dosages as though reading from my documentation template. I applied oxygen via nasal cannula and took a more detailed history. How long had she been short of breath? Since early evening. Any chest pain? Mild pressure, nothing sharp. Had she called 911 herself? She nodded, then said something that made my hands pause over the blood pressure cuff. "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago. Same eyes, same way of tilting your head when you listen." I deflected politely, professional boundaries intact, and completed my vital signs. Blood pressure 140/90, oxygen saturation 88% on room air. I radioed dispatch to report my findings and request guidance. Only static answered. I tried again. Nothing. I checked my portable. Full battery, correct channel. I told Mrs. Marsh I'd be transporting her to County General for further evaluation and began preparing the stretcher I'd brought in from the ambulance. As I worked, she spoke in that unhurried way some elderly patients have, as though time were irrelevant. She mentioned a daughter who'd moved away years ago, a husband who'd worked for the railway, a garden she used to keep behind the house. Then, with the same casual tone, she said, "You're driving Unit 12 tonight, aren't you?" "That's the one with the broken latch on the left cabinet. Garrett usually jiggles it 3 times before it opens." I stopped moving. Garrett's habit with that latch was something I'd noticed only yesterday, a minor quirk he'd never mentioned aloud. I asked how she knew. She smiled, gentle, sad, and said, "You told me last time." I explained carefully that this was my first response to this address. She nodded as though I'd confirmed something rather than corrected her. "First for you, maybe. But the call doesn't always arrive in order." I didn't respond to that. I helped her onto the stretcher, secured the straps, and wheeled her out to the ambulance. The street remained empty. The other houses showed no lights, no signs of life. I loaded her into the patient compartment, checked her oxygen flow, and climbed into the driver's seat. The GPS still displayed 473 Oakmont Terrace as my location. But when I shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb, the route back to the highway didn't match the route I'd taken in. The roads were the same, narrow, tree-lined, but the turns came in different sequences as though the geometry had quietly rearranged itself. The drive to County General took 23 minutes. Mrs. Marsh remained stable, her breathing eased by the supplemental oxygen. She didn't speak during transport, but occasionally I caught her watching me in the rearview mirror, her expression peaceful and resigned. When we arrived at the emergency department, I gave my report to the triage nurse, transferred care, and wheeled the empty stretcher back to the ambulance. Standard procedure. I returned to station, restocked my supplies, and completed my patient care report on the laptop mounted in the crew quarters. I documented everything: times, vitals, interventions, patient statements. I saved the report and uploaded it to the central database, then radioed dispatch to mark myself available for additional calls. The dispatcher who answered, a different voice than the one who'd sent me to Oakmont Terrace, acknowledged and cleared me. I asked casually if there was any record of the earlier call. She put me on hold, then returned sounding puzzled. "I'm not showing any dispatch to that address tonight. What time did you receive it?" I checked my logbook. 01:15. She checked her CAD system, the computer-aided dispatch software that logged every call, every transmission, every unit movement. "Nothing here. Are you sure you copied the time correctly?" I was sure. I read her the address. She searched by location, no record, no call, no dispatch. She suggested I might have responded to a different address and transposed the numbers in my notes. "It happens sometimes," she said, "especially on night shifts." I thanked her and signed off, uneasy but unwilling to argue. Fatigue, maybe. Stress. First solo shift. I'd sort it out in the morning. At 04:30, I checked my uploaded patient care report to review what I'd written. The document opened normally, showing Mrs. Marsh's name and the address on Oakmont Terrace. But as I scrolled down, I found entries I didn't remember typing. Additional observations. A note about a faint scar on her left wrist. A comment about the floral wallpaper pattern matching a design common in homes built between 1952 and 1957. Details I'd noticed but hadn't consciously documented. The handwriting, digital yes, but formatted in the way I structured my sentences, looked like mine. The timestamp on the file showed I'd completed it at 03:48, which was accurate. But the content felt collaborative, as though someone had filled in gaps while I wasn't looking. I opened the CAD history on the laptop, searching for the dispatch record the radio operator had claimed didn't exist. Still nothing. But when I checked the GPS unit in the ambulance, the route to 473 Oakmont Terrace was saved in the device's memory, complete with breadcrumb markers showing my exact path. I pulled up the satellite view. The road I'd driven was there, narrow, tree-lined, unmistakable. But when I zoomed in on the address itself, the map displayed only an empty lot overgrown with grass. No houses, no streetlights, no curb numbers. I didn't sleep well during my off-duty hours. I kept thinking about Mrs. Marsh's knowing smile, her casual mention of details she shouldn't have known. The next evening, I returned to station for my second solo shift and checked the laptop again. My patient care report had updated. New entries appeared below my original documentation. Observations about a second transport I hadn't run, a patient whose name I didn't recognize. The address was different, but the narrative style matched mine. I scrolled to the bottom of the document. The last line, added sometime in the past 18 hours, read, "Patient expressed familiarity with responder, claiming prior contact. Responder has no memory of previous encounter." I asked the day shift medics if anyone else had accessed my report. They hadn't. I asked if Mrs. Marsh had been admitted to County General. The triage nurse I'd handed her off to had no record of an Evelyn Marsh arriving during that shift. No elderly female with respiratory distress. No patient matching that description at all. I showed her the documentation on my laptop. She read it, frowned, and said the narrative looked complete and professional. But she couldn't reconcile it with her own records. She suggested the patient might have been rerouted to a different facility. It happened sometimes during high-volume nights. But the night I'd transported her hadn't been high volume. It had been quiet, preternaturally so. Over the following week, the report continued to grow. New calls appeared, each one describing emergencies I hadn't responded to, but could almost remember the way you recall a dream that evaporates upon waking. The addresses were scattered across the county, some familiar, some impossible to locate on any map. The patients' names changed, but their familiarity with me remained constant. They knew my routines. They mentioned my training officer by name. They asked about my mother using her maiden name, a name I'd never shared with dispatch or documented in any official record. I began checking the laptop compulsively, watching the report populate itself in real time. Sentences appeared while I stared at the screen, or typing themselves in my formatting style, using my abbreviations describing scenes I would encounter hours or days later. The timestamps made no sense. Calls logged for dates that hadn't arrived yet. Patient outcomes documented before the incidents occurred. I tried deleting the file. It reappeared within minutes, fully restored, as though the system had preserved a backup I couldn't access. The dispatchers started noticing discrepancies. Calls I claimed to have run that didn't appear in CAD. Times I marked myself en route when their records showed me in quarters. They pulled me aside for a counseling session, gentle but firm, asking if I was struggling with the demands of solo shifts. I showed them the report on the laptop. They saw a standard patient care document, complete, appropriately detailed but singular. Only the original call to 473 Oakmont Terrace. No additional entries, no phantom calls. They suggested I take a few days off, get some rest. Stress could manifest in strange ways during field training. I took their advice, but the report kept updating. I checked it from home, logging into the system remotely, and watched as new calls appeared, addresses I would be sent to during my next shift, patients I would meet with injuries I would document in the exact phrasing already present on the screen. It was no longer a record of what I had done. It was a script of what I would do, written in a version of my own hand that understood where the calls were leading before I did. Last week I responded to a chest pain call at an address the GPS took 40 minutes to reach, even though the map showed it was only 8 miles from station. The patient, a man in his 60s, greeted me by name and asked if I'd figured it out yet. I asked what he meant. He said, "The calls keep coming, but you're always driving toward the same place. Just takes a different route each time. I'm still running shifts. The senior medics say I'm doing fine, that my documentation is thorough and my patient care is competent. They don't see the entries I see. They don't notice when I respond to calls that dispatch never sent, or when I return from scenes that don't appear in anyone's logs but my own. Mrs. Marsh's address is still saved in the GPS, and sometimes late into a shift, the device suggests it as a destination. Not because dispatch has called me there, but because the route is already stored, waiting. I've started noticing something else. The laptop now shows calls I haven't run yet, filled out in complete detail, down to the patient's final words. And every address, no matter how distant or winding the route, seems to spiral back toward Oakmont Terrace, a street that exists only on the nights I'm dispatched there, and only long enough for me to arrive and leave again. Some calls log themselves before the phone ever rings, and once your name appears in that record, the route stops being about where you're going. It's about where the calls think you've always been heading. Story 2. The critical care paramedic and the empty stretcher. The cardiac monitor displayed a stable sinus rhythm, 72 beats per minute, normal axis, no ectopy. But the stretcher beneath the electrodes was empty. I reached out to disconnect the leads, thinking they'd somehow coupled with my own heartbeat through stray contact. But when my fingers touched the adhesive pads, they were warm and slightly damp, as though they'd been applied to skin moments before. The rig's suspension creaked, settling lower on its axles, and I felt the weight distribution shift as something invisible adjusted its position on the mattress. The receiving facility's charge nurse met me at the ambulance bay doors and asked why I'd arrived so early. I checked my watch. I'd lost 4 hours somewhere between floors. I've worked as a critical care paramedic for 11 years, specializing in interfacility transports between rural hospitals and tertiary care centers. The job requires a particular temperament, comfortable with autonomy, capable of managing ventilators and infusion pumps during hour-long drives, able to make clinical decisions without physician oversight when circumstances deteriorate faster than radio signal can travel. I'm credentialed in advanced cardiac life support, pediatric critical care, and neonatal transport. My license is clean. My continuing education is current. I hold certifications in transport protocols that most paramedics never need. The work is methodical, procedural, and predictable. At least it was. The call came through at 14:30 on a Thursday afternoon in late November. Dispatch requested I transport a 68-year-old male from Riverside Community Hospital to the cardiac catheterization lab at Metro Regional, approximately 90 miles northeast. The patient, listed as Harold Finch, had presented with an ST elevation myocardial infarction, received thrombolytic therapy, and now required emergent angiography and possible stent placement. Time-sensitive but stable for transport with standard ACLS monitoring. I acknowledged, prepped the rig, and drove to Riverside's emergency department, arriving at 1500 hours. The charge nurse met me at the ambulance entrance, clipboard in hand, looking puzzled. She asked if there had been a miscommunication with dispatch. I said no. I was there for the STEMI transfer. She glanced at her assignment board, then back at me. We called that off 20 minutes ago. The patient decompensated. We're prepping him for airlift instead. I checked my phone. No cancellation message. I radioed dispatch. They confirmed the transport was still active in their system. No updates received. The nurse shrugged, apologetic, and said she'd sort it out with the coordinator. I returned to the ambulance, irritated by the wasted drive, but accustomed to the occasional administrative tangle. I was preparing to clear myself from the call when my pager vibrated with a new message. Proceed with Finch transfer. Patient loaded. Depart for Metro Regional immediately. I stared at the screen. Loaded? I walked to the rear of the ambulance and opened the doors. The stretcher was locked in place, fully elevated, with the mattress unoccupied. But the cardiac monitor was active, displaying a rhythm strip I hadn't initiated. The waveform showed normal sinus rhythm, rate 72. Clean QRS complexes marching across the screen in regular intervals. I leaned in and checked the lead connections. All 5 electrodes were attached, not to a patient, but positioned on the mattress in anatomically correct locations. Right shoulder, left shoulder, right lower ribs, left lower ribs, in the V-lead near where a patient's chest would rest. The cables hung slack. No one had placed them there. I'd prepped the rig alone, and I always coiled the leads after equipment checks to prevent tangling. I disconnected the electrodes. The rhythm continued for 3 seconds, then flatlined into a systole before the monitor powered down. I reconnected them, puzzled. The monitor booted up, and after a moment, the rhythm returned. Same rate, same morphology, impossibly stable for a system detecting no bioelectrical activity. I ran through the logical explanations. Electrical interference from the ambulance's power inverter, faulty leads picking up stray RF signals, a grounding issue creating false readings. None fit. The waveform was too clean, too physiologic. It looked exactly like a healthy heart rhythm, just without a heart to generate it. My radio crackled. Dispatch, asking for an ETA. I responded that there'd been confusion about the patient's status, and I was clarifying with the hospital. The dispatcher sounded impatient. We show the patient loaded at 15:05. You should already be en route. I climbed into the patient compartment and examined the stretcher more carefully. The sheets were rumpled, not neatly tucked the way I'd left them. An indentation ran down the center of the mattress. Subtle but distinct, the kind of compression that forms under a body's weight. I pressed my hand into it. The foam was warm. I pulled back the top sheet. Beneath it, a hospital gown lay folded, and beside it, a pair of non-skid socks, both still creased from packaging. Standard issue for patients being transferred. I hadn't placed them there. I returned to the ED and found the charge nurse. I asked if anyone from her staff had loaded equipment or supplies into my rig. She said no. I asked if Harold Finch was still in the department. She checked her tracking board. He coded 10 minutes ago. We're still working him. I walked back to the ambulance, uneasy, but not yet alarmed. Medical transport involves constant coordination between multiple parties, and miscommunication creates strange situations. Perhaps another crew had prepped my rig by mistake. Perhaps the monitor had been left running from a previous call and its memory was replaying stored data. I decided to reset the equipment, clear the call with dispatch, and return to station. But when I reached for the ignition, the vehicle's weight shifted, a perceptible dip in the rear suspension, as though someone had climbed into the patient compartment. I turned. The privacy curtain between the cab and the patient area was drawn, which was wrong. I never closed it unless transporting. I pulled it aside. The stretcher was still empty, but the cardiac monitor now showed additional data. Blood pressure 120/80. Oxygen saturation 98%. Respiratory rate 16 per minute. All parameters normal. All biologically impossible without a patient connected to the sensors. The IV pump, which I'd left offline, was running a saline infusion at 75 milliliters per hour. The bag hung from the hook, tubing primed, drip chamber half full, but the distal end terminated in a capped needleless connector, attached to nothing. I shut down the equipment manually, unplugging the monitor and the pump. The displays went dark. I sat in the driver's seat, forcing calm, and called my supervisor to report a possible equipment malfunction. He told me to return to base for inspection and he'd dispatch another crew to cover the region. I started the engine, engaged the transmission, and pulled onto the highway heading west toward station. 3 miles into the drive, the patient compartment's door latch clicked. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the narrow gap in the curtain, I saw the cardiac monitor glowing again, its screen bright despite being unplugged. The rhythm strip scrolled past, still sinus, still stable. The IV pump's digital display showed the infusion continuing, volume delivered increasing in real time. I pulled onto the shoulder and got out, circling to the rear of the rig. The doors were closed but not latched. I opened them. The stretcher rails creaked, springs adjusting, and the mattress compressed in the center as though bearing weight. I grabbed the mattress and shook it. Firm resistance met my effort, heavier than the foam alone. I lifted the edge. Beneath it, pressed into the vinyl, were faint outlines. 2 shoulder blades, a spinal ridge, the curve of a pelvis. Impressions that faded even as I stared at them, smoothing back to neutral. but leaving behind warmth that seeped into my palms. I backed away from the rig, pulling out my phone to photograph the monitor readings, but when I raised the camera, the screen showed only darkness. The devices were off. I lowered the phone. The monitors glowed. I raised it again. Darkness. I climbed back into the cab and resumed driving, my mind cycling through rationalization. Stress, fatigue, a CO leak from the exhaust manifold, some environmental toxin causing hallucinations. But the rig had passed inspection 2 weeks prior, and I felt lucid, sharply, uncomfortably aware of every detail. The road stretched ahead, empty of traffic. I focused on the mile markers, counting them down. 40 miles to base, then 35, then 30. At mile marker 28, the GPS recalculated, rerouting me toward Metro Regional Hospital, my original destination. I canceled the route and re-entered the station address. The GPS recalculated again, still directing me northeast. I switched to manual navigation, following the signs for the county road that led back to base. But each turn I took seemed to curve subtly wrong, the geometry of the intersections refusing to align with my memory. After 20 minutes, I passed the same gas station twice, its faded sign and cracked pavement unmistakable. I pulled into the lot and checked my odometer. I'd driven 70 miles since leaving Riverside, far more than the distance back to base. Yet I recognized nothing around me. My phone's map app showed my location as a blank space between labeled roads. No GPS coordinates, just a gray void. The radio crackled with dispatch, asking my status. I reported I was en route to base, but experiencing navigation issues. The dispatcher asked my current location. I read the name of the gas station from the sign. She paused, then said that station had closed in 2009. I looked at the building again. The lights were off, the pumps removed, the windows papered over. But I was parked in the lot, gravel crunching under my tires. I asked her to ping my GPS unit. She tried and reported no signal. "Are you still transporting Harold Finch?" I told her no, the transport had been canceled. She said that's not what her system showed. According to the CAD log, I'd departed Riverside Community Hospital with Finch at 15:20 and was due at Metro Regional at 1700. It was now 16:45. I was running ahead of schedule. I checked the patient compartment. The stretcher rails were raised. The cardiac monitor displayed full vitals. The IV pump showed 200 milliliters infused. And now, for the first time, I saw the airway equipment deployed. A bag valve mask connected to the oxygen regulator positioned near the head of the mattress where a patient's face would be. The reservoir bag inflated and deflated in a steady rhythm, 16 breaths per minute, synchronized perfectly with the respiratory rate on the monitor. I disconnected the oxygen. The bag continued to move. I placed my hand over the mask. Warm, humid air pulsed against my palm with each mechanical breath. I jerked back, striking my elbow against the cabinet, and the rig's suspension groaned, settling lower. The stretcher's weight distribution had shifted again, the axles compressing as though the patient load had increased. I stepped outside and examined the tires. The rear pair sagged noticeably despite the rig being empty. I radioed dispatch and requested immediate backup, reporting a possible equipment emergency. The dispatcher acknowledged and said she'd send a unit to my location as soon as I provided coordinates. I read them from my phone. She paused. "That puts you 6 miles east of Metro Regional." Impossible. I'd been driving west. But when I looked up, I saw the hospital complex in the distance, 12 stories of concrete and glass unmistakable against the twilight sky. My GPS confirmed it, arrival in 8 minutes. I hadn't turned around. The road had simply delivered me here, regardless of the direction I'd chosen. I climbed back into the cab and completed the drive, no longer trusting my sense of control but unable to refuse the route. I arrived at Metro Regional's emergency department at 16:58, 2 minutes ahead of schedule. The receiving nurse met me at the bay, glancing at her watch. "You're early. We weren't expecting Finch until 5. I opened the rear doors. She looked inside at the empty stretcher, then at me. "Where's the patient?" I gestured at the monitor, the IV pump, the vitals that continued to scroll across screens despite the absence of anyone to measure. She frowned and checked her transfer paperwork. "It says here you picked him up at 15:20. Who signed the chart?" I pulled the transfer document from the clipboard mounted inside the rig. At the bottom, beneath the hospital seal, was my signature, dated and timed at 15:20, just as she'd said. My handwriting, my credential number, but I'd never signed it. I'd never taken custody of Harold Finch. The nurse made a phone call, then returned, looking more confused. "Riverside says Finch died at 15:35. They never released him for transport, but our system shows him checked in here at..." "Wait." She scrolled through her tablet. "At 1400 hours. That's impossible. You weren't even dispatched until after that." I asked her to show me the record. She did. The admission entry listed Harold Finch, transferred from Riverside Community Hospital via critical care ground transport, delivered by my name and credential number at 1400 hours. 90 minutes before I'd even received the call. The clinical notes described his arrival in stable condition, the handoff report I'd allegedly given, and the interventions performed by Metro's cardiology team. They'd taken him to the cath lab at 14:30. He'd received 2 stents. He was currently recovering in the ICU. I asked to see him. The nurse hesitated, then agreed, perhaps sensing my need for confirmation. We took the elevator to the 4th floor. The ICU was dim and quiet, most patients sedated behind sliding glass doors. She led me to room 412 and gestured inside. Through the window, I saw an elderly man lying intubated, chest rising and falling with ventilator breaths. Cardiac monitor tracing a stable rhythm identical to the one I'd been watching in my empty rig for the past 2 hours. The nurse checked his wristband. "Harold Finch, date of birth matches. This is your patient." But I'd never transported him. I'd never seen him conscious. I'd driven 90 miles with a stretcher that carried weight I couldn't see and vitals I couldn't explain, and somehow the destination had received him hours before I'd left. The nurse asked if I was feeling all right. I said I needed air and walked back to the elevator, my hands shaking. When I returned to the ambulance, the stretcher was neatly made, sheets tucked, equipment powered down and stowed. The cardiac monitor was off. The IV pump was empty. And clipped to the cabinet door was a completed transport checklist, signed and dated in my handwriting, documenting a patient I had delivered before I'd ever been called to pick him up. I drove back to base in silence, the rig feeling lighter now, the suspension returning to normal. My supervisor asked how the equipment malfunction had resolved. I told him everything checked out, just a loose connection. He nodded, satisfied, and cleared me for the next call. But I've started noticing things. The times don't always match. I'll depart a facility and arrive at the destination before the clock says I should, or I'll spend an hour on the road and find only 10 minutes have passed. Patients I've never met recognize me. Receiving nurses mention conversations I don't remember having. My documentation appears in charts before I write it. And every few shifts I'm dispatched to a call that's already been completed, by me according to the logs, hours or days earlier. The stretcher is always empty when I check, the monitor always shows vitals, and the weight in the back always grows heavier with each mile as though something is settling in, patiently waiting for the route to close the loop between where I think I'm going and where the record insists I've already been. Some transports don't end when you reach the destination. They just restart from a point further along the route you thought you were still driving. Story 3. The emergency dispatcher's double voice. I heard myself say, "Units be advised, structure fire at 22 Maple Grove, caller reports entrapment." 3 seconds before I intended to speak the words. The voice came through my headset from Channel 7, the backup frequency we used only during system overloads, and it carried the exact inflection I would use, down to the slight pause I always took before saying caller reports. I looked at my screen. No call had come in yet. Then line 4 lit up, and a panicked woman said her house was on fire and her daughter was trapped upstairs. I asked the address. She said, 22 Maple Grove. I've been an emergency dispatcher for the Regional 911 Center for 9 years, handling calls across a 3-county area that includes 2 mid-sized cities, 8 townships, and a sprawling network of rural routes. The job requires a specific cognitive rhythm, simultaneously listening, typing, speaking, and prioritizing while multiple emergencies unfold in parallel. You learn to partition your attention, to hold a suicidal caller's trust on line 1 while dispatching officers on channel 2 and monitoring a traffic accident's progression on channel 3. You develop an internal clock that tracks response times without conscious thought, and you cultivate a tone, calm, firm, procedural, that becomes automatic regardless of what you're hearing. The 911 Center operates from a windowless room on the 2nd floor of the County Public Safety Building. 12 workstations arranged in 2 rows, each equipped with a multi-line phone system, a computer-aided dispatch terminal, and a radio console controlling 6 channels. The room is kept cool to prevent equipment overheating, and the lighting is fluorescent and constant, making it easy to lose track of time. During day shifts, all 12 stations are staffed. At night, the number drops to 4. On the overnight shift, I worked 2300 to 0700. It usually dropped to 2. Myself and a second dispatcher who handled the northern sector while I covered south and central. The night it began was a Tuesday in mid-March, unremarkable until it wasn't. I arrived at 22:45, relieved the evening dispatcher, and settled into Station 5, my usual seat. The console displayed the standard array, CAD software on the center monitor, mapping interface on the left, radio controls on the right. I logged in, checked the call queue, empty, and scanned the active incident board. 2 units on traffic stops, 1 ambulance en route to a hospital with a non-emergency patient. Quiet. The kind of night where you caught up on training modules and hoped the phone stayed silent. At 0030, I received a call on line 2. Male voice, mid-30s, breathless. He said his father had collapsed and wasn't breathing. I obtained the address, 41 Cedar Lane, and began pre-arrival CPR instructions while dispatching Paramedic 7 and Ambulance 12. Standard cardiac arrest protocol. The caller followed my directions, starting chest compressions while I counted the rhythm aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4. The call lasted 11 minutes. The medics arrived, took over care, and transported. I cleared the incident and documented it in CAD. 20 minutes later, I heard my own voice on Channel 7, the backup frequency, saying, "Paramedic 7, Ambulance 12, respond to 41 Cedar Lane for a cardiac arrest, CPR in progress." I stopped typing mid-sentence. Channel 7 shouldn't have been active. We only used it during multi-agency incidents or when the primary channels were saturated. I checked the radio console. Channel 7 showed green, open, transmitting, but I hadn't keyed it. I clicked over to monitor the frequency. Silence. I switched back to Channel 1, the primary dispatch channel, and continued with my current call. A minor vehicle accident. No injuries. But part of my attention remained on Channel 7, waiting for it to activate again. At 01:15, I heard myself dispatch a domestic disturbance to 1812 Oakwood Avenue. The voice was mine. Same cadence, same phrasing, same way I said caller reports verbal argument escalating. But I hadn't received that call yet. I checked the queue. No calls holding. I checked the incident board. No address on Oakwood Avenue. 10 seconds later, line 4 lit up. A woman whispering, saying her boyfriend was breaking furniture and threatening her. I asked her address. She said 1812 Oakwood Avenue. The words I needed to say were already forming in my mind, but I hesitated, listening to Channel 7. My voice came through the headset, calm and clear. Units 3 and 5 respond to 1812 Oakwood Avenue for a domestic disturbance. Caller reports verbal argument escalating, no weapons seen. I hadn't keyed my microphone yet, but the dispatch was already going out, transmitted by a version of myself I couldn't see. I muted my headset and stood looking around the room. The second dispatcher, a woman named Angela, was handling a call at Station 2. Her back to me, her voice occupied with a medical emergency in the northern sector. No one else was present. I sat back down, unmuted, and dispatched the domestic disturbance on Channel 1, my words layering over the identical transmission still echoing from Channel 7. The responding officers acknowledged on Channel 1, seemingly unaware of the duplicate. I documented the call, hands unsteady, and made a note to report a possible radio malfunction to the tech supervisor. For the next hour, Channel 7 remained silent. I handled 6 more calls: a burglary alarm, a welfare check, 2 traffic stops, a suspicious person report, and a noise complaint. All routine. I began to convince myself I'd imagined the earlier transmissions, or that some odd crosstalk from a neighboring jurisdiction had leaked into our system. At 02:30, Angela took her break, leaving me alone in the room. The building was silent except for the hum of electronics and the occasional hiss of radio static. At 02:43, I heard myself say on Channel 7, "All units be advised, we have a report of shots fired at the Evergreen Motel, room 14, multiple callers. Approach with caution." My hands froze over the keyboard. No call had come in. The phone lines were dark. I stared at the console, waiting. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then line 1, line 2, and line 3 lit up simultaneously. I answered line 1, a man shouting that someone was shooting at the motel. I put him on hold and grabbed line 2, a woman screaming about gunfire. Line 3, another voice, same report. I began the dispatch, but my voice on Channel 7 was already speaking, describing the incident in the exact words I would have chosen, issuing the same cautions, directing the same units. Officers 3, 5, 8, and 12 acknowledged on Channel 1, and I heard their acknowledgments echo on Channel 7 a fraction of a second later, as though the backup frequency were replaying the primary channel's transmissions with a slight delay, or perhaps a slight advance. I dispatched the call, coordinated the response, and monitored the officer's arrival. The scene was chaotic. Multiple witnesses, conflicting descriptions, shell casings found in the parking lot, but no shooter located. The officers cleared after 40 minutes, filing reports for follow-up investigation. I closed the incident in CAD and sat back, my heartbeat loud in my ears. Angela returned from break and asked if I was all right. I said I was fine, just a complicated call. She nodded and returned to her station. I didn't mention Channel 7. I didn't know how to explain that I was hearing myself dispatch calls before they came in, that my voice was transmitting instructions I hadn't yet decided to give. At 03:30, I decided to test it. I opened a blank incident in CAD and typed a fictional address, 99 Sycamore Street. I didn't transmit anything, didn't key the radio, just watched Channel 7 and waited. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. I felt a flicker of relief. Then my voice came through the headset. Ambulance 12, respond to 99 Sycamore Street for an unresponsive person. Caller reports patient is cold to the touch. I stared at the radio. No call had come in. I'd invented the address. But 3 seconds after the transmission, line 2 rang. I answered. A woman's voice, shaking, said she'd found her neighbor unresponsive and he felt cold. I asked the address, my throat tight. She said 99 Sycamore Street. The impossible had become procedural. I dispatched the call, listened to my voice on Channel 7 confirming details I hadn't yet spoken, and watched as the response unfolded exactly as the backup frequency had already described. The patient was deceased. The coroner was notified. The scene was cleared. I documented everything in CAD, my hands moving mechanically through the routine. At 0400, I tried to ignore Channel 7. I muted it on my console, silencing the frequency so I couldn't hear the transmissions. But when the next call came in, a vehicle accident on Highway 12, I felt a strange pressure in my head, as though someone were trying to speak through me, pushing words into my mouth before I'd chosen them. I resisted, pausing before I transmitted, changing my phrasing deliberately to deviate from what I sensed the other voice wanted me to say. But when I listened to the recording later, my transmission on Channel 1 matched, word for word, what I'd heard myself say on Channel 7 before I'd muted it. At 0430, Angela received a call and began dispatching a medical emergency. I heard her voice on Channel 1, clear and professional. Then I heard her voice on Channel 7, saying the same things but 3 seconds ahead. I looked over at her. She continued working, unaware. I unmuted Channel 7 on my console and listened. My voice came through, describing a fire I hadn't yet received a call for. 10 seconds later, line 1 lit up. A woman reporting smoke coming from her neighbor's garage. I dispatched it, but this time I listened carefully to the words coming out of my mouth, comparing them to what Channel 7 had already transmitted. They were identical, not similar but exact, down to the filler words and the brief pause I took to check the map coordinates. I wasn't choosing what to say. I was repeating a script that had already been spoken by a version of myself I couldn't locate. At 0500, the voice on Channel 7 addressed me directly. "Stay on script," it said, using my voice, my tone. "It's easier if you stay on script." I keyed my microphone, hands shaking, and said, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "You know who this is, you've always known." I looked around the room. Angela was absorbed in her call. The other stations were empty. The voice on Channel 7 continued. "You'll receive a call in 30 seconds. Residential fire, 22 Maple Grove. Entrapment reported. Say exactly what I say when I say it. Don't deviate." I sat frozen, staring at the phone lines. 30 seconds felt like an eternity. Then Lean 4 lit up. I answered. A woman, hysterical, said her house was on fire and her daughter was trapped on the 2nd floor. I asked the address, though I already knew. She said 22 Maple Grove. The voice on Channel 7 began. "Units be advised, structure fire at 22 Maple Grove. Caller reports entrapment. Engine 4 and truck 2 respond. Ambulance 12 stage at the corner." I keyed my microphone and repeated it, word for word, my voice synchronizing with the transmission from Channel 7. The units acknowledged. The call proceeded. But I wasn't dispatching anymore. I was narrating something that had already been decided, following a sequence that had been set in motion before I'd even heard the caller's voice. For the rest of the shift, I listened to Channel 7 and repeated what I heard. Every call came in exactly as the voice predicted. Every dispatch matched the script. Angela noticed nothing unusual. The officers and medics responded without question. The system functioned smoothly, seamlessly, as though the duplication were a feature rather than a flaw. At 0630, as my shift neared its end, I tried once more to deviate. A call came in for a welfare check. Channel 7 told me to send Unit 5. I dispatched Unit 8 instead, deliberately choosing the wrong responder. Unit 8 acknowledged and started toward the address. But halfway there, Unit 8 radioed back saying dispatch had reassigned the call to Unit 5 and they were returning to patrol. I checked CAD. The incident log showed Unit 5 as the assigned responder, even though I'd typed Unit 8. I listened to the recorded radio traffic. My voice clearly said, Unit 5, not Unit 8. I had changed nothing. The script had corrected itself. At 0700, I logged out and left the building exhausted and disoriented. I drove home in silence, unable to reconcile what I'd experienced with any rational framework. I slept poorly, waking every hour to check my phone, half expecting to see a call coming in that I'd already answered in a dream. When I returned for my next shift 2 days later, I accessed the archived radio recordings and listened to Channel 7's transmissions from that night. The frequency was silent. No duplicate dispatches, no voice matching mine. Just dead air and occasional static. But I remembered hearing it. I remembered repeating it, and when I checked the incident logs, every call I'd handled that night matched the sequence I'd heard on Channel 7 down to the second. I asked the tech supervisor if there'd been any issues with the radio system. He said no. I asked if Channel 7 had been active that night. He checked the logs and said it hadn't been used in 3 weeks. I didn't argue. Now every shift I listen for it. Some nights Channel 7 stays silent and I dispatch calls the way I was trained, reacting, deciding, choosing words in real time. But other nights, I hear myself speaking before I've thought the words, describing incidents that haven't been reported yet, guiding responders to scenes I haven't been told about. And on those nights, I know I'm not creating the dispatch. I'm performing it, following a version of the call that's already been made by a voice that knows what I'll say before I do. The officers and medics never notice. The system functions. The calls get answered. But I've started to wonder if I'm dispatching in real time or just catching up to transmissions that have already gone out, spoken by a version of myself that exists a few seconds ahead, forever narrating the next call I'll receive, the next decision I'll make, the next words I'll repeat until I can't tell which voice is mine anymore. Some frequencies don't carry your words. They carry the version of you that's already said them, waiting for you to catch up and say them again. Story 4. The Rural Paramedic's Mile. That took an hour. We'd been driving for 43 minutes when I realized the mile marker ahead, number 87, was the same one we'd passed at the beginning of the call. I tapped the odometer reset, watched it zero out, and fixed my gaze on the road. The GPS insisted we were moving at 55 miles per hour, but the marker didn't recede into the distance. It stayed ahead, constant and fixed, as though the road were treadmill beneath our tires. My partner looked at me, sweat beading on his forehead despite the autumn chill, and said, "We've been here before." Not here in the abstract sense. Here, in this exact curve, with this exact tree leaning at this exact angle 3 times in the past hour. I've worked as a paramedic in the rural sector for 15 years. Covering an area so vast and sparsely populated that some addresses exist only as coordinates on a forestry map. Out here, roads have names but no signs, and directions rely on landmarks that might be a fence post, a particular oak tree, or a culvert someone painted red in 1984. We run calls for farming accidents, ATV rollovers, chainsaw injuries, and the occasional hunter who's misjudged distance or sobriety. The distances are long, the backup non-existent, and the terrain unforgiving. You learn to be self-sufficient, to troubleshoot mechanical problems on dirt roads at 3 in the morning, and to navigate by instinct when GPS signals fail under heavy canopy. My partner that night was a newer medic named Lucas Brennan, 28 years old, confident but still learning the peculiarities of rural response. He'd transferred in from a suburban system 6 months prior and was still adjusting to the isolation and the long transports. We worked well together. He was meticulous with documentation. I was better at reading terrain and weather. On that particular October evening, we were stationed at the Volunteer Fire Hall in Ashfield Township, a crossroads settlement with a population of 243 waiting out the final hours of a 12-hour shift. At 21:30, the pagers went off. Dispatch reported a motor vehicle accident with injuries on County Road 44, approximately 1 mile south of the junction with Daniels Pike. Single vehicle, rollover caller reported the driver was conscious but trapped. Standard extrication call. Lucas and I grabbed our gear, started the rig, and pulled onto the county road heading south. The night was clear, the moon 3/4 full, visibility good. Daniels Pike was a well-known landmark, a narrow east-west road that connected 2 townships. The accident scene should have been easy to locate, 1 mile south of that junction. A straight shot, maybe 3 minutes of drive time. Lucas drove, I navigated. The GPS displayed the route, south on County Road 44 for 0.9 miles, then arrive at the coordinates dispatch had provided. Simple. The road unspooled in the headlights, flat, bordered by fields recently harvested, the stubble glowing faint gold in the light. We passed a farmhouse on the left, a silo on the right, a historical marker noting some forgotten skirmish from the Civil War. The odometer ticked off 0.2 miles, then 0.4, then 0.6. At 0.8 miles, Lucas slowed, scanning the roadside for wreckage or skid marks. Nothing. We continued to 0.9, then 1.0. No accident, no debris, no caller flagging us down. I radioed dispatch for confirmation. They repeated the location. County Road 44, 1 mile south of Daniels Pike. We were there, but the scene wasn't. Lucas suggested the caller might have misjudged the distance, so we continued south, scanning both sides of the road. At mile 1.5, we reached an intersection I didn't recognize. The GPS recalculated, suggesting we'd overshot. Lucas turned around and we headed north, retracing the route. As we drove, I noticed the farmhouse again, same structure, same lit window, same pickup truck parked in the driveway. Then the silo, then the historical marker. Lucas frowned. Didn't we just pass these? We had, but we were heading north now, not south. The landmarks should have appeared in reverse order. I checked the GPS. It showed us moving north on County Road 44 at 55 miles per hour, but the road ahead looked identical to the road we'd just driven. The same gentle curve, the same fence post leaning left, the same cluster of trees silhouetted against the horizon. I asked Lucas to slow down. He did, bringing us to 30 miles per hour. The scenery continued to repeat. Farmhouse, silo, marker, curve, fence post, playing in a loop regardless of our speed or direction. At 21:50, we'd been searching for 20 minutes. I radioed dispatch and reported we were unable to locate the scene. The dispatcher sounded confused. According to her GPS tracking system, we were stationary at the coordinates she'd provided. I looked at the rig's GPS. It showed us moving. I looked out the window. The road scrolled past. But dispatch insisted we weren't moving, that we'd been sitting at the accident site for the past 18 minutes. Lucas stopped the rig. We got out. The road stretched in both directions, empty and silent. No accident, no other vehicles, no caller. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint smell of diesel and turned earth. I walked 50 feet south, examining the pavement by flashlight. No skid marks, no glass, no fluid stains. Nothing to indicate a vehicle had ever left the road here. Lucas checked the north side with the same result. We returned to the rig, unsettled but still operational. I suggested we expand the search radius. Maybe the caller had misidentified the road. Lucas agreed, and we continued south. At mile 2.3, the road ended at a T-junction I'd never seen before. The intersecting road had no sign, just gravel stretching east and west into darkness. The GPS offered no label, no route number. I consulted the paper map we kept in the glove box. According to it, County Road 44 ran straight for 12 miles with no T-junctions. But here we were, facing a choice of direction with no information to guide us. Lucas chose west arbitrarily, and we turned. The gravel road was rough, slowing us to 20 miles per hour. Trees pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a tunnel that swallowed the moonlight. After 5 minutes, we emerged onto pavement again, smooth, well-maintained, familiar. It was County Road 44. I checked the mile marker on the roadside. 87. The same marker we'd passed at the start of the call. We'd somehow looped back to our starting point, even though we'd turned at an intersection that shouldn't exist. Lucas stopped the rig and looked at me. "This doesn't make sense." I agreed, but there was no time to debate geometry. We had a call to respond to. I radioed dispatch and requested confirmation that the accident was still active. They said yes, the caller was on scene, asking where we were. I asked if they could patch me through to the caller. They did. A male voice came through, shaky and breathless. He said the driver was still trapped and bleeding, asking how much longer we'd be. I asked him to describe his exact location. He said County Road 44, 1 mile south of Daniels Pike, just like he'd told the first crew. I asked what he meant by first crew. He said another ambulance had arrived 20 minutes ago, assessed the scene, then left without helping. I felt a chill spread through my chest. We were the only unit dispatched. I asked him to describe the crew. He said 2 paramedics, a man and a woman, driving a rig with our unit number on the side. Lucas and I exchanged a look. I asked the caller to stay on the line and we'd be there as soon as possible. We resumed driving south, watching the mile markers, 88, 89, 90. At 91, the road curved left. We followed it. The scenery shifted subtly, fewer fields, more trees, the canopy denser. At 92, we saw the farmhouse again. Same structure, same lit window. At 93, the silo. At 94, the historical marker. The loop was tightening, repeating faster. As though the road were contracting around us, I checked the clock. We'd been en route for 47 minutes. 1 mile should have taken 3. Lucas gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He said, "What if we stop trying to reach it? What if we just pull over?" I considered that, but we had a patient. Someone was trapped and bleeding, waiting for us to arrive. We couldn't abandon the call, no matter how distorted the route had become. So we kept driving. The mile markers continued. 95, 96, 97. Then abruptly 87 again. The loop had closed. We'd traveled 10 miles and arrived at the same point we'd started. Lucas slammed the brakes. The rig skidded slightly on the pavement, then stopped. He turned to me, his face pale. "We're not getting there. The road won't let us." I wanted to argue, to insist there was a logical explanation, a navigation error, a mapping glitch, something mundane, but the evidence was undeniable. We'd driven in a straight line and looped back. We turned at an intersection that didn't exist on the map. We'd been tracked by dispatch as stationary while we moved continuously. The road was keeping us from the scene, or the scene was keeping us on the road, and I couldn't determine which. At 22:18, my radio crackled with a new transmission from dispatch. They were canceling our response. The accident had been cleared by another unit. I asked which unit. They said ours. I said that was impossible. We were still en route. The dispatcher paused, then said their CAD log showed we'd arrived at 21:52, treated and transported 1 patient to County General and cleared the scene at 22:10. I asked her to check the hospital's records. She did, conferring briefly with someone off-channel, then returned. The hospital confirmed they'd received a trauma patient from our rig at 2240. In the future. Lucas stared at the radio. I stared at the road. The dispatcher asked if we were all right, if we needed to return to base. I said yes, we'd return to base, though I had no confidence we could find it. Lucas shifted into drive and turned the rig around, heading north on County Road 44. This time the scenery didn't repeat. The farmhouse appeared once, then the silo, then the marker. After 6 minutes, we reached the junction with Daniels Pike and turned west toward the fire hall. As we drove, Lucas asked me what had happened. I didn't have an answer. The call had existed, we'd received it, dispatch had confirmed it, a caller had described us arriving and leaving, but we'd never reached the scene. Yet according to the records, we'd completed the transport, delivered the patient, and documented the entire encounter. I checked my run report clipboard. A fresh patient care report sat there, filled out in my handwriting, describing a 23-year-old male with a rollover mechanism, blunt trauma to the chest and abdomen, conscious and alert, transported in stable condition. I had no memory of writing it, but the signature at the bottom was mine. We arrived back at the fire hall at 22:35. The other crew, Medic 9 from the neighboring district, was there, parked in the bay, restocking their rig. I asked if they'd run the call on County Road 44. They said no. They'd been on a nursing home transfer all evening. I showed them the report with my signature. They looked at it, confused, and said they had no knowledge of that call. I spent the rest of the shift reviewing the timeline. Dispatch logs, hospital admission records, GPS tracking data, radio transcripts. Every system showed the same thing. We'd arrived at the scene, treated the patient, and transported him successfully. The patient, listed as Daniel Merrick, age 23, was in the trauma bay at County General, recovering from injuries sustained in a single vehicle rollover on County Road 44. The attending physician's notes referenced the field treatment we'd provided: spinal immobilization, IV access, pain management, treatment I didn't remember giving. 3 days later, I visited County General and asked to see Daniel Merrick's chart. The registrar pulled it up and confirmed he'd been admitted following a paramedic transport. I asked if I could speak with him. She said he'd been discharged the previous day, but she could give me the contact information he'd left. I took it and called the number. A young man answered. I identified myself as the paramedic who'd transported him. He thanked me, said I'd probably saved his life. I asked if he remembered the transport. He said yes, clearly. 2 paramedics, a man and a woman, arrived about 30 minutes after the accident. They'd treated his injuries, loaded him into the rig, and driven him to the hospital. The drive had taken maybe 20 minutes. Routine. Professional. He remembered talking to the female paramedic, me, about his college classes and his plans to study engineering. I didn't remember any of that, but he described the interior of our rig accurately, down to the placement of the equipment cabinets and the crack in the rearview mirror. He described my voice, my mannerisms, the reassurances I'd given him. He said I'd told him the road was tricky at night, that sometimes it took longer to get where you're going than you'd expect, but we always got there eventually. I thanked him and ended the call. I never told Lucas what the patient had said. I'm not sure he'd believe me, and I'm not sure I want to explain it. But I've thought about it constantly, about the mile that took an hour, about the road that looped back on itself, about the version of me that arrived at the scene while I was still trying to reach it. We still run calls on County Road 44. Sometimes the route is direct and the scenes are exactly where dispatch says they'll be. But other times the drive stretches, the landmarks repeat, and I feel the road pulling us into a loop we've already completed. And when we finally arrive, Always later than we should, always after the logs say we've already been there. The patients recognize us. They thank us for the care we gave them during a transport we have no memory of running. Some roads don't take you to the destination. They take you through the time it takes to arrive over and over until the trip and the arrival stop being separate things and you realize you've been at the scene all along, just traveling through the hour it took to get there. Story 5. The flight paramedic's unscheduled descent. The altimeter read 800 feet and descending, but my inner ear insisted we were climbing. I glanced at the pilot, Kirk, 15 years with the service, unshakable, and saw his hands frozen on the cyclic, his eyes locked on the GPS screen displaying coordinates that shifted by a single digit every 3 seconds, pulling us incrementally southwest toward a location the map labeled only as Training Site Decommissioned 1997. The radio was silent. The nav lights below showed no roads, no structures, just an expanse of dark trees broken by a clearing that matched with eerie precision the landing zone where I'd lost my first patient 9 years ago. I've been a flight paramedic with Lifeline Air Medical for 12 years, specializing in critical scene responses and interfacility transports across a 200-mile radius. The job demands a particular tolerance for controlled chaos, treating unstable patients in a vibrating airframe while managing ventilators, infusion pumps, and monitoring equipment, all within an environment where space is measured in inches and every decision must account for altitude, weather, and fuel. You learn to think in 3 dimensions, to read terrain from the air and to trust your pilot with a certainty that borders on faith. Our crew is small: pilot, flight paramedic, flight nurse. We rotate shifts, 72 hours on, 72 off, living in the quarters adjacent to the helipad, ready to launch within 5 minutes of a call. The night it happened, I was 6 hours into a shift that had been quiet, unusual for a Saturday in late November when weather turns unpredictable and trauma calls spike with holiday traffic. My crewmates were Kirk Holloway, pilot, and a flight nurse named Rachel DeWitt, both veterans with thousands of flight hours. We'd settled into the routine of an uneventful night. Equipment checks completed, coffee brewed, weather updates monitored. At 02:30, I was half asleep in the recliner, drifting through that shallow rest you learn to take when you know you might be airborne in minutes. The alarm jolted me awake, a piercing tone that signaled a priority launch. I sat up, adrenaline already clearing the fog, and checked the dispatch screen mounted on the wall. The display was lit, showing a red alert icon but no text, no address, no incident type. Just the coordinates and the word, launch. Kirk and Rachel were already moving, pulling on flight suits and helmets without question. I grabbed my gear and followed, assuming the details would come through once we were airborne. Sometimes dispatch information lagged by a few seconds due to system latency. It happened. We reached the helicopter, a Bell 429, configured for medical transport with a patient litter, full monitoring suite, and pharmaceutical stores, and performed the rapid pre-flight check. Kirk fired the turbine. The rotors began their slow acceleration, and within 4 minutes of the alarm, we lifted off the pad, climbing into the cold November darkness. As we ascended, I expected the radio to crackle with details from dispatch: patient condition, mechanism of injury, estimated time to scene. Instead, silence. I keyed my mic and requested information. No response. I tried again. Static. Kirk checked the avionics. The radios were functional, frequencies correct, but no transmissions were coming through. Rachel pulled up the flight plan on the onboard GPS. The destination coordinates appeared: latitude 41.739, longitude 82.416, but the location name field was blank. Kirk frowned and entered the coordinates into the terrain database. The system returned a result: Training Site decommissioned, 1997. I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition I couldn't place. I asked Kirk what training site. He didn't know. The database offered no additional details. Rachel searched the medical dispatch log for any recent calls in that area. Nothing. The coordinates placed us approximately 38 miles southwest of our base, over a stretch of state forest with no towns, no hospitals, no infrastructure. An odd location for a medical emergency, but not impossible. Rural hunting accidents, lost hikers, remote cabin incidents. We'd responded to stranger places. As we flew, I noticed the GPS coordinates subtly changing. The latitude and longitude shifted by a single digit every few seconds. Always southwest, always incrementally, as though the destination were drifting or our target were moving slowly through the forest. Kirk compensated, adjusting our heading to follow the creeping coordinates. The altimeter showed our descent profile, dropping from 2,000 feet to 1,500, then 1,200, then 900, following the terrain as we approached the landing zone. At 800 feet, my inner ear began to rebel. The instruments said we were descending, the altimeter confirmed it, but my vestibular system insisted we were climbing. I glanced at Rachel. She looked pale, one hand braced against the bulkhead. I asked if she felt it. She nodded. Like we're going up, not down. Kirk's voice came through the intercom, steady but tight. I'm flying the instruments. They say we're descending. We trusted him. You have to trust your pilot when your senses disagree with the gauges. But the dissonance was nauseating, a visceral wrongness that made my stomach lurch with every second. The trees below grew closer, their tops visible in the faint moonlight. At 500 feet, Kirk began searching for the landing zone. The GPS indicated we were directly over the coordinates, but the terrain below showed only forest. No clearing. No lights, no indication of an emergency. Then abruptly the trees opened. A clearing appeared, roughly circular, maybe 80 feet in diameter, covered in low grass and bordered by dense pines. In the center sat a vehicle, overturned, resting on its roof, windows shattered. No lights, no movement, no signs of recent disturbance. The scene looked frozen, staged, like a training exercise left unfinished. Kirk brought us into a hover, scanning for hazards, power lines, unstable terrain, bystanders. Seeing none, he committed to landing, setting the skids down gently on the grass 30 feet from the wreckage. As the rotors spun down, I unstrapped and grabbed my trauma bag. Rachel followed with the cardiac monitor and airway kit. We approached the vehicle cautiously, announcing ourselves. No response. I shone my flashlight through the shattered driver's window. A single occupant, male, mid-30s, suspended upside down by his seatbelt, unconscious. Blood on his face, chest moving shallowly. Mechanism consistent with rollover trauma. I reached in to assess his pulse, rapid, thready, and called to Rachel for C-spine stabilization. She moved to the passenger side. As I worked, a strange familiarity settled over me. The vehicle's make and model, the positioning of the occupant, the pattern of injuries visible in the dim light. I'd seen this before, not something similar. This, exact. Seen. I froze, my hand still on the patient's wrist, and tried to recall where. The memory surfaced slowly, reluctantly. A training exercise 9 years ago during my certification course for flight paramedicine. We'd practiced extrication techniques on a staged rollover in a clearing that looked exactly like this. The instructor had used a high-fidelity mannequin, lifelike, weighted, responsive, to simulate an unconscious driver. I'd been the primary medic. I'd performed the same assessment, called for the same equipment, followed the same protocol, and I'd made a mistake, a critical one. I'd missed a tension pneumothorax that decompensated during transport, leading to a simulated cardiac arrest that I couldn't reverse. The mannequin died in flight, The instructor had used it as a teaching moment. Even experienced medics can miss life-threatening injuries under stress. But the patient in front of me wasn't a mannequin. His pulse was real, his blood was real, his shallow breathing was real. I forced the memory aside and continued the assessment. Rachel and I stabilized his spine, extricated him from the vehicle using controlled technique, and moved him to the litter. As we worked, I kept glancing at his face, looking for some confirmation that he was a stranger, someone I'd never encountered. But the features were wrong. Too generic, too neutral, like a composite sketch rather than an individual person. We loaded him into the helicopter. Kirk restarted the turbine and we lifted off, climbing back toward our normal cruise altitude. Rachel initiated IV access. I placed him on high-flow oxygen and began a secondary assessment. Vitals were unstable, BP 90/60, heart rate 130, respiratory rate 32. I listened to his lung sounds, diminished on the right, hyper-resonant to percussion, textbook tension, pneumothorax. The same injury I'd missed during the training exercise. This time, I didn't miss it. I prepped for needle decompression, identified the landmarks, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and inserted the catheter. A rush of air hissed out, and the patient's vitals immediately began to stabilize. Rachel looked at me, relief evident even through her helmet visor. I documented the intervention, my hands steady, my mind screaming that this wasn't real, that we'd somehow flown into a memory, a reconstruction of a moment I'd failed years ago. The flight to the trauma center took 18 minutes. The patient remained stable, responding appropriately to treatment. We landed on the hospital's rooftop helipad, transferred him to the waiting trauma team, and gave our report. The receiving physician asked for the patient's name. I realized I didn't have it. We'd found no identification at the scene, and he'd been unconscious the entire time. Rachel checked the dispatch notes on her tablet. The patient name field was blank. The physician frowned but accepted the report. We returned to the helicopter, completed the post-flight checklist, and launched back to base. During the return flight, I asked Kirk if he recognized the training site. He said he'd never heard of it, and he'd been with the service since 2003, well after 1997. I described the scene, the clearing, the vehicle, the setup, and he shook his head. Doesn't sound familiar, but if it's decommissioned, maybe it was before my time. Back at base, I filed the flight report and searched the archives for records of training sites used by the service. I found references to several locations, but none matched the coordinates we'd flown to. I checked historical satellite imagery. The clearing existed, but the aerial photos showed no vehicle, no structures, no signs of recent use. I pulled my own training records from 9 years ago, looking for the location where I'd practiced extrication. The address was listed as a private training facility in Pennsylvania, 300 miles from the coordinates we'd responded to tonight. But the patient had been real. The trauma center confirmed his admission. The physician's notes described the injuries I'd documented, the interventions I'd performed, the needle decompression that had saved his life. The only missing piece was his identity. No name, no insurance, no personal effects. He remained a John Doe in the system, recovering in the ICU from injuries sustained in an accident no one had reported and a scene no one could relocate. 3 days later, I received a message from dispatch asking me to clarify details about the flight. They had no record of the launch. No call had come in. The coordinates I'd documented didn't match any active requests in their system. They asked if I'd confused the date or transposed numbers from a different call. I insisted the flight had occurred exactly as I'd reported. I provided Kirk and Rachel as witnesses. Dispatch contacted them. Kirk confirmed the flight. Rachel confirmed the flight. But when dispatch checked the helicopter's flight data recorder, a device that logs every launch, route, and landing. There was no entry for that night. The aircraft had not left the pad. According to the data, we'd remained grounded the entire shift. I stopped trying to reconcile the discrepancies. The patient existed. The trauma center had him. The interventions I'd performed had worked. Whether the flight had officially occurred or not felt secondary to the fact that someone was alive because we'd responded. But I couldn't shake the memory of the scene, the clearing that matched my training exercise, the patient with the injury I'd once missed, the coordinates that drifted as we flew, pulling us to a place that no longer existed on any map. Last week, the John Doe was discharged from the hospital. The social worker contacted me, hoping I might provide information that could help identify him. I visited during my off-duty hours and spoke with him briefly. He was polite, grateful, and utterly unfamiliar. He had no memory of the accident, no recollection of how he'd ended up in the overturned vehicle, and no identification. But when I mentioned the clearing in the state forest, he smiled, faintly, sadly, and said, "That's where they train people, isn't it? To get it right the second time." I asked what he meant. He closed his eyes and said he was tired. I left without pressing further. The helicopter still launches on legitimate calls, and I still respond, performing my duties with the same precision I've maintained for 12 years. But some nights, the GPS suggests a route that deviates slightly southwest, toward coordinates that drift and change, pointing to a training site that was decommissioned decades ago. And I wonder if the calls we answer are always moving forward, or if sometimes they pull us back, offering a chance to correct what we missed, to save the patient we couldn't save before, in a scene that exists only long enough for us to arrive and leave again, carrying someone who was never there until we needed them to be. Some flights don't take you to new scenes. They take you back to the ones you never left, waiting for you to land in the moment you got it wrong, and giving you just enough time to get it right before the coordinates drift again. Story 6. The Hazard Response Medic and the Room Without a Door. The digital thermometer in my gloved hand read 48 degrees Fahrenheit, but my breath wasn't fogging. The air tasted metallic, sharp, with a chemical signature my detector couldn't identify, and the particulate counter showed clean, no contamination, no airborne hazards. Yet my throat tightened with each inhalation as though I were breathing something my instruments refused to acknowledge. Behind me, the doorway we'd entered through had vanished, replaced by seamless drywall painted the same institutional beige as the rest of the corridor. My partner pressed his hand against the wall where the door had been and said very quietly, "The scanner's picking up respiration on the other side. It matches your rate exactly." I've been a paramedic with hazardous materials certification for 14 years, assigned to the regional hazmat response team that handles chemical spills, industrial accidents, confined space rescues, and biological exposure incidents. The work requires a meticulous mindset, every action governed by protocol, every entry into a contaminated environment preceded by thorough atmospheric testing, every piece of protective equipment inspected and double-checked. You learn to trust your instruments more than your instincts because your senses can deceive you in toxic atmospheres. But a calibrated gas detector will not. The team consists of 6 cross-trained paramedics and firefighters, rotating through on-call shifts that cover a 4-county area, including 2 manufacturing districts and a regional medical complex. The call came in at 13:45 on a gray afternoon in mid-December. Dispatch reported a possible chemical exposure at County General Hospital, specifically in the decommissioned West Wing, a section of the facility that had been closed for renovations 3 years prior and remained unfinished due to budget constraints. A maintenance worker had entered to assess water damage and reported feeling dizzy and nauseous with a strong chemical odor present. He'd exited the area and called for evaluation. Standard procedure. We'd assess the scene, test the atmosphere, determine if evacuation or decontamination was necessary, and provide medical clearance or transport as needed. My partner for the response was a firefighter-paramedic named Joel Carr, methodical and experienced, someone I'd worked with for 6 years without incident. We loaded the response vehicle with atmospheric monitoring equipment, personal protective gear, and medical supplies, then drove to County General. The hospital's safety coordinator met us at the main entrance and escorted us to the West Wing. The area was cordoned off with plastic sheeting and caution tape. Access restricted to authorized personnel only. The maintenance worker who'd made the call sat on a bench in the adjacent hallway, looking pale but stable. We assessed him briefly. Vital signs normal. No respiratory distress, no visible burns or contamination. And he described the odor as sharp, like metal or cleaning solution, localized to a specific room on the 2nd floor. Joel and I donned level C protective suits, full-face respirators, chemical-resistant coveralls, double gloves, boots. We powered up the multi-gas detector, calibrated that morning, testing positive for all sensors, and entered the West Wing. The air inside was stale and cool, the lighting dim with only emergency fixtures active. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with closed doors and construction equipment covered in dust. We climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, our boots echoing on the bare concrete. The maintenance worker had indicated room 214 as the source of the odor. We located it at the end of the corridor. The door was propped open with a wooden wedge. I checked the multi-gas detector. Oxygen 19.5%, carbon monoxide 0, hydrogen sulfide 0, lower explosive limit 0. Clean. No atmospheric hazards detected. I radioed our findings to the command post downstairs and proceeded with entry. Joel followed, carrying a secondary detector and a particulate counter. The room was perhaps 15 by 20 feet, empty except for exposed drywall, a concrete floor, and a single window covered with brown paper. The temperature inside felt colder than the hallway, and the air carried the metallic odor the worker had described. Distinct, unpleasant, but not overwhelming. I swept the room with the gas detector, checking for pockets of concentrated vapor. Nothing registered. Joel tested for particulates, asbestos, silica, biological contaminants. The counter showed near 0 readings. Yet the odor persisted, and as I moved deeper into the room, I felt my throat constrict slightly, a reflexive response to inhaling something irritating. I knelt and examined the floor for residue or spills. Clean. I checked the walls for staining or moisture. Dry. Joel scanned the ceiling for leaks or mold. Nothing. The room appeared entirely unremarkable, yet something about it felt wrong, a subtle dissonance I couldn't articulate. The air was too still, the silence was too complete. Even through the respirator's filtered intake, the metallic taste coated my tongue, sharp and insistent. Joel called my name. I turned. He was standing near the window, pointing at the paper covering. I joined him and we peeled back the edge. Beneath it, the window was intact, but the glass was fogged from the inside, moisture condensing in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Whirls and lines that suggested movement, as though someone had traced shapes on the surface. I wiped the condensation away with my glove. It returned within seconds, reforming the same patterns. I radioed the command post and requested building maintenance records for room 214. While we waited, Joel set up a portable environmental scanner, a more sensitive device that could detect trace chemicals below the threshold of the multi-gas detector. He activated it and swept the room. The display flickered, showing fluctuating readings that spiked and dropped without pattern. He recalibrated and tried again. Same result. The device was functioning. Self-test passed, battery full, but the readings made no sense. It was detecting something, but the signature didn't match any substance in its database. The command post radioed back. Room 214 had been used for storage prior to the wing's closure. No hazardous materials had been logged in the space, no incidents reported. I acknowledged and decided to extend the assessment. Joel and I moved methodically around the perimeter, testing air samples at different heights, checking ventilation ducts, examining electrical outlets. At the far corner of the room, near the back wall, the temperature dropped sharply. My thermometer read 48 degrees, 12 degrees colder than the ambient temperature we'd measured in the corridor. I checked for drafts. None. I looked for HVAC registers. The room had no active ventilation. Joel noticed it too. He moved his gloved hand through the cold zone, mapping its boundaries. It was localized, roughly 3 feet in diameter, and the chill was intense enough that our breath should have fogged inside the respirators. It didn't. I pulled the thermometer out and watched the reading. 48 degrees, constant, no fluctuation. I moved the thermometer a foot to the left. 61 degrees, back into the cold zone. 48, exact, repeatable, impossible. I knelt in the cold spot and felt the floor. The concrete was frigid, as though refrigerated. I pressed my glove flat against it and felt something else. A faint vibration, rhythmic, like a pulse. I pulled my hand back and checked the environmental scanner. It was showing elevated readings again, spiking specifically in the cold zone. I asked Joel if he felt the vibration. He knelt beside me, placed his hand on the floor, and nodded. Like a heartbeat. I stood and backed away from the cold zone, uneasy but not yet alarmed. Unusual thermal gradients could occur due to plumbing leaks, radiant heat loss, or structural anomalies. The vibration might be related to mechanical systems elsewhere in the building. But my training insisted on thorough investigation. I radioed the command post and requested schematics for room 214. Plumbing, electrical, structural. They said they'd retrieve them from archives. While we waited, Joel ran a handheld thermal camera over the walls, looking for temperature differentials that might indicate hidden voids or water intrusion. The camera showed the cold zone clearly, a deep blue patch on the floor, but also something unexpected. On the wall directly behind the cold zone, the thermal image displayed a warm silhouette, vaguely human-shaped, as though someone were standing on the opposite side of the drywall, their body heat radiating through. Joel and I exchanged a look. The room backed onto another room, 213 according to the corridor layout. But we'd passed 213 on our way in, and it had been locked, marked with a "Do Not Enter" sign. I left Joel in 214 and walked back to 213. The door was locked, just as I'd seen before. I knocked. No response. I radioed the command post and requested a key. They said maintenance would bring one. I waited. 5 minutes passed. The maintenance worker arrived, key in hand, and unlocked 213. I pushed the door open and shone my flashlight inside. The room was a mirror of 214, empty, unfinished, cold. But the wall separating the two rooms, the wall where the thermal camera had detected the warm silhouette, was blank. No heat, no figure, just drywall. I returned to 214. Joel was still scanning with the thermal camera. I asked if the silhouette was still visible. He checked. No, it's gone. I felt a prickle of unease. We'd been in the room for nearly 30 minutes, and nothing we'd measured made coherent sense. The chemical odor with no source, the cold zone with no explanation, the vibration that felt organic, the thermal silhouette that appeared and vanished. Every instrument indicated the space was safe, yet every instinct said otherwise. I decided to conclude the assessment and recommend the room be sealed pending further investigation. As I turned toward the door we'd entered through, I stopped. The door was gone. The doorway, the opening we'd walked through, propped with a wooden wedge, had been replaced by a solid wall. Smooth drywall, painted beige, continuous with the rest of the corridor. No seam. No indication it had ever existed. Joel saw it at the same moment. He walked to the wall and pressed his gloved hands against it. Solid. He pounded with his fist. The sound was muffled, absorbed, as though the wall were thicker than it should be. I checked my radio. No signal. The frequency was dead, filled with static. I tried my phone. No service. Joel tried his. Same result. I forced calm and walked the perimeter of the room, looking for another exit. There was none. The window was the only opening, and it was sealed, the glass intact and likely painted shut. Joel pulled out a pry bar from his equipment pack and approached the wall where the door had been. He wedged the bar into a corner and pulled. The drywall didn't crack or splinter. It flexed slightly, then resisted, as though reinforced from behind by something stronger than studs. I checked the environmental scanner. It was showing maximum readings now, off the scale, flashing red, but still no identifiable contaminant. I checked the gas detector. Clean. I checked the particulate counter. Clean. The instruments insisted the air was safe, but the scanner insisted something was present, saturating the room with a substance it couldn't name. Joel set down the pry bar and turned to me. "We need to breach the window." I agreed. We moved to the window and removed the paper covering completely. The glass beneath was fogged again, the condensation forming patterns that now looked unmistakably like handprints. Small, delicate, pressed against the interior surface. I wiped them away. They reappeared. Joel struck the glass with the pry bar. The impact made no sound. The glass didn't crack. He struck again, harder, still nothing. The window absorbed the force without response, as though we were hitting something that wasn't entirely solid. I turned back toward the room and saw the environmental scanner sitting on the floor near the cold zone. Its display had changed. Instead of numerical readings, it now showed a waveform, a rhythmic pattern that rose and fell with regularity. I picked it up and watched. The waveform matched the vibration we'd felt in the floor. It matched a respiratory rate, 16 breaths per minute, human normal. I checked my own respirator. My breathing rate was elevated, maybe 20 breaths per minute due to stress. Joel's would be similar, but the scanner was detecting 16. I asked Joel to hold his breath. He did. I held mine. The scanner's waveform continued, uninterrupted, steady. Something else in the room was breathing. Something our instruments could detect but not identify. Something the wall had closed in with us. Joel saw the waveform and understood immediately. He picked up the thermal camera and scanned the room again. This time, the silhouette appeared not on the wall, but in the center of the floor, directly over the cold zone. It was clearer now. A prone figure, human-sized, lying flat. The heat signature visible as though the body were warming the concrete from below. But we were on the second floor. There was no basement, no substructure. Below us should have been only the first-floor rooms. I knelt beside the cold zone and placed my gloved hand on the concrete again. The vibration was stronger, more pronounced. And now I felt something else. Rhythm, pattern, a deliberate sequence. It wasn't mechanical. It was communicative. I counted the intervals. 3 short pulses, 3 long, 3 short. SOS, a distress signal. The floor itself was transmitting it, or something beneath the floor, or something that had become part of the floor. Joel backed toward the wall, his breathing rapid now, audible through the respirator. "We need to get out." I agreed, but there was no exit. The door was gone. The window was impenetrable. I checked the environmental scanner again. The waveform had shifted. It now displayed 2 patterns overlaid. One at 16 breaths per minute, one at 20. The second pattern matched my elevated respiratory rate. The device was reading me, not through the external sensors, but through something else, It was detecting my breathing from inside the room as though I were on the other side of the wall. I stood and approached the wall where the door had been. I pressed my ear against the drywall, listening. Faintly, I heard movement, footsteps, voices, the ambient noise of a hospital corridor. I pounded on the wall. "We're inside, open the door!" My voice sounded muffled, swallowed by the space. I pounded again. The voices outside continued, uninterrupted as though no sound were escaping. Joel joined me, both of us striking the wall, shouting. The thermal camera slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. The display shattered, but the device continued to function, its screen flickering with fragmented images. The room, the cold zone, the silhouette. And now, for the first time, a second silhouette appeared. Then a third. Figures lying prone in the cold zone, overlapping, layered. As though the room were accumulating presences, stacking them in the same space, compressing time into a single frozen moment. I grabbed the pry bar and swung it at the wall with everything I had. The bar passed through the drywall as though it were mist, meeting no resistance, and struck something solid beyond. Metal, ringing, resonant. I pulled the bar back. The wall was intact. No hole, no damage, but the ringing continued, echoing, and I realized I'd struck something that existed in the space the wall occupied, something layered between where we were and where the corridor should be. The environmental scanner's alarm sounded, a piercing tone indicating a critical detection threshold. I looked at the display. It showed a single word repeating, "Proximity, proximity, proximity." The contaminant it had been trying to identify wasn't a chemical. It was distance, or the absence of it. The room was detecting our presence as though we were approaching something, closing in on a threshold, but the scanner couldn't determine what we were getting closer to because we weren't moving. The room itself was proximity, a space that collapsed distance, that placed us adjacent to something without intervening separation. Joel grabbed my arm and pointed at the floor. The cold zone was expanding, spreading outward in a slow, inexorable circle. The temperature was dropping. My thermometer now read 41 degrees. The vibration was stronger, the SOS signal pulsing through the concrete with urgency. And now I understood. The room wasn't trapping us, it was remembering us, it was preserving the moment we'd entered, layering it over previous moments, previous presences, creating a palimpsest of occupants who'd stood in this space and never fully left. The door reappeared, not where it had been, but on the opposite wall. Sudden, complete, as though it had always been there. I didn't question it. Joel and I ran toward it, crossing the cold zone. As we did, the floor gave slightly, compressing like foam, and I felt the vibration shift. No longer SOS, but something else, something faster, something that matched our footsteps. We reached the door, I grabbed the handle and pulled. The corridor beyond was empty. No maintenance worker, no command post, no plastic sheeting, just a long hallway painted institutional beige, lit by flickering fluorescence, stretching into darkness. Joel and I stepped through and the door closed behind us, sealing with a soft click. I turned. The door was labeled Room 214, but we'd exited into a corridor that didn't match the layout we'd entered through. I checked my radio. Signal restored. I called the command post. No response. I tried my phone, service available. I dialed Joel's number. It rang. He answered, standing 3 feet from me. His voice came through the phone, but also from behind the door we'd just closed. A third voice, my own, said, "The scanner's picking up respiration on the other side. It matches your rate exactly." We didn't go back inside. We walked the corridor until we found a stairwell, descended to the ground floor, and exited the west wing through a side door that opened onto the hospital's loading dock. The safety coordinator found us 20 minutes later, asking where we'd been. "We'd been missing for 3 hours," he said. though our respirator's air supply indicated only 40 minutes had elapsed. He asked for our assessment of room 214. I told him it should remain sealed. He asked why. I said the atmospheric readings were inconclusive and further investigation was required. The room was sealed the next day, marked with biohazard placards, and removed from the renovation schedule indefinitely. I've reviewed the sensor data from our equipment. The recordings show clean air, normal temperatures, no contaminants. But the thermal camera's damaged file contains a single image captured in the moment before it fell. 3 silhouettes lying in the cold zone. One matches my dimensions. One matches Joel's. And the third belongs to someone who entered that room before us, whose breathing the scanner detected, whose presence the floor remembered, and who never left. Or who left only to return again and again, layered into the space, breathing on the other side of a wall that has no door until it decides you've been there long enough to need one. Some rooms don't trap you by locking the exits. They trap you by making you part of the atmosphere, a contaminant the instruments can't identify, a presence that persists long after you've walked out, still standing in the cold zone, breathing in rhythm with everyone who's ever been sealed in with you.